Ben Cobley, welcome back to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thanks very much. Really good to be with you.
Likewise, I remember the last time we spoke, you told me that a book was on the way, and here it is, The Progress Trap, The Modern Left and the False Authority of History. So let's get into this today. We live in a world where progress is feted almost above all else, whilst simultaneously being derided by its opponents. So maybe we open with a little bit about some similarities between some of the proponents of progress, which sometimes find themselves also part of the decolonization camp, as well as those who detract from it. And then maybe within that, we even talk about your understanding of what progress is. So let's begin with the similarities between those who seek to decolonize the world and those who are being accused of being colonizers or colonizers from history. So we'll open with a quote of yours for you to unpack. The spirit of progressivism colonizes our institutions with progressive identity politics. It colonizes our land by appropriating it, cordoning it off, and selling it off to people from elsewhere. And it colonizes our minds with consumerism so that we do not notice or do not care.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite a mouthful, that one. It's like, well done for sort of saying it all right. Yeah, I recall that's from the chapter about progressive capitalism. I think it closes that chapter. So it's really that about. I mean, you've got the progressive identity politics, which is obviously quite a theme in the book, but then especially in that chapter, I'm dealing with capitalism, obviously, and particularly in that about land and how we treat land, and basically as something which needs to be maximized for production. Now that's in a sort of a capitalistic, if you like, liberal form of progressivism, where progress comes from continual increases in production, GDP. And when I talk about handing the land away, sort of parceling it up and then selling it off to people from elsewhere, that's referring to mass immigration and how this sort of process of maximizing the production of land, effectively what our rulers do, and a lot of the business lobbies do, is they fight relentlessly to increase the population, so they've got more choice of workers, also more consumers within the country, and this has the effect of boosting GDP, boosting production, profits, all the rest of it. And the flip side of that is of course that it's crowding up the country, and also bringing in lots of influences from outside, which many people find sometimes difficult and disturbing to deal with. Also increases, obviously, the competition over land. So land and property, housing becomes a lot more expensive. So really, that's what I was driving at. But you mentioned in your talk there about what the different sides have in common. Now, I wanted actually you to clarify that there. You're talking about the progressive identity politics. You mentioned decolonization.
Yes.
And then this other maximizing, the productivity, as it were, like cramming as many people onto this island as possible. So, I mean, is that correct? Sorry.
Well, I think broadly, I just remember reading that passage, or at least several passages in the book, and in fact, I think you make this point explicitly, where those who consider themselves to be part of the decolonizing crowd don't necessarily recognize that the things that they're railing against, let's say the historical fact of colonialism and colonization, this idea that it was a mortal sin for European nations to go and find themselves trading and governing and ruling over foreign lands, and that it was a dispossession of sorts, and that they had almost no right in being there, and it set off in train all of these Western ideologies and ways of being which were incongruous with the lands in which they found themselves in. Whereas I think the point you make in your book about the decolonizers is that they end up colonizing wherever it is that they are in the world. So whether it's in academia with their ideas, whether it's as you just mentioned, that their ideas then become in practical reality, where it might actually be the inviting in of large diasporas of people who then end up continuing on a set of cultural practices which are not historically aligned with the place that they're in. And so I suppose, when did you become aware of those similarities? Were there things that started to click into place in your mind where you go, oh, hang on, what they're accusing people of, they're actually guilty of, but in another way?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you basically made my argument there, so thanks very much for that. I do sometimes forget. But yeah, very much so. In terms of, I mean, if you look at the history of European colonization, let's take just British colonization, so, say of Africa. There was, in the 19th century, a lot of talk of the three C's. So you're talking about civilization, commerce, and Christianity. So we're going to bring those things to Africa, the dark continent, and we're going to civilize them, get rid of the oppressive cultural practices they had, get rid of the slave trade, of course, which doesn't fit in the decolonizer story. So behind it, there was a lot of talk of actually improving that place where they were, colonizing and going to and actually fighting wars and all the rest of it. And I mean, I think it's quite obvious when you put it in that framework that it's very similar to what decolonizers, if you like, or this is really what the progressive identity politics, what I call the industrial complex around it. What they're saying they're trying to do is remove oppressive practices, from, say, this country, other Western countries. And they're also very much against, of course, nativism. They don't like sort of traditions which are grounded in the long-standing population or whatever, and inherited authorities from that place. So it's dynamically it's pretty much, I was going to say pretty much the same, but it's obviously there's major differences, but serious similarities. And really a lot of what they're doing does come from the Western progressive intellectual tradition. I mean, you might say especially Marxism, but there are major continuities. I'd like to think it's obvious from what I've said with the more general liberal progressivism, if you like. So that's basically, it was really doing a lot of reading around, just out of interest about, historical, the imperial time, and just noticing those things.
You open the book with a very interesting observation, and in some ways I can see that you've been influenced by someone we're both a mutual fan of, John Gray, who has made the point in some recent books of his, the New Leviathans being one of them, but there are others, about the concept of progress having been inherited from the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West. This idea that there is always an ascendancy toward something paradisical. And you have effectively said that the difference between the progressivism of the day is that the progressives have replaced the position that God once occupied with history. So why, in the mind of the progressive, can history not be denied? Where does this impulse come from to be focused so much on history?
I actually think it's quite I tend to think of what's going on, and a lot of it has been, I think you mentioned inherited. Progress is almost inherited from Christianity. And I tend to think of it like that, as a style, not so much a mind, a sort of a conscious, oh, we need to sort of do this, but it's just like a kind of dynamics that you're used to. Think back to the 19th century again with the, maybe the imperial period, the period of liberal confidence, if you like, Whiggishness as well. As you see it, you see sort of concepts like providence and progress almost being used interchangeably by them. And it's not like, I haven't seen anyone go, oh, we need to do this. It's almost just like the style just sort of crosses over almost naturally. And I think that still goes very much on today. With Christianity, there are so many similarities in the style of progressives to the Christian style. Obviously, they've discarded a lot of the complicated, difficult, annoying doctrines and institutions, and just kind of kept hold of a certain number of things. Like you could say that the future-oriented temporality, whereby things are going to be better in the future, either through a gradual process or through revolutionary rupture. You also have, of course, the role of the victim. Jesus as an emblem of who died on the cross for our sins, and through his example, we can change society. That sort of dynamic reproduces itself all the time now through activism. George Floyd is the classic example. A really troubled man, a criminal, but who was a real, really suffered in life, and ended up getting killed at the hands of, an obviously oppressive individual who was part of an apparently oppressive state apparatus. So it's reproducing in a large sense. And I owe this, obviously this sort of interpretation to Tom Holland, who talks about this type of thing. And, the Jesus dying on the cross, it's very much a style that is with us today, but just it's not Jesus anymore. He's not dying on the cross. Now he sort of appears constantly through different individuals, like George Floyd, like I said, and it's very much a pattern that reproduces itself. So I hope that answers your question. I may have gone off piece somehow, but no, that's certainly what I was talking about in that chapter.
Yeah, and I've spoken with David Starkey a few months ago, and he made the point within, I think it was an exclusive Substack Q&A for the paid subscribers, so not everyone would have heard it, but then I heard him make the same point on Andrew Gould's Heretics, is that wokeism, progressivism, effectively he lays it at the foot of Christianity's door, much like Tom Holland says it is a heretical take on Christianity. And indeed it is, because what has been left behind, the figure of Jesus, this symbol for adherence to him, to recognize our own faults and then spend our lives trying to turn away from them and fix them and become better and try to become godly, though never being God. And that each one of us, every single one of us is fallen, that we all are equal in dignity for being human. And yet the desiccated version of it, even though Starkey would say, go and look at the Magnificat prayer and see that effectively it's just progressivism, is that, well, that's not strictly true, because progressivism does not recognize the notion that everyone is fallen. In fact, only their opponents are fallen. It's only they who can't see things, and actually they're not to be afforded equal dignity either, because they're not on the right side of history.
So does David Starkey say that? Because I make a similar argument in the book,
No, he doesn't. He doesn't.
He doesn't.
No, he just conflates progressivism with Christianity and kind of makes the point that Christianity is, if Christianity serves any purposes, that it's a decent drapery for power, but otherwise, it's got a lot to answer for because it's led to progressivism.
Yeah, no, it's interesting the way that almost the Christian church, I'm thinking Church of England, primarily. If you listen to the average, Church of England priest speaking on Thought for the Day on Radio 4, they're talking exactly the same language as progressive activists. And it's almost like they're grabbing hold of that to almost keep themselves in the game, and talking in the same language, same style, same focus on, relentless compassion towards the outsider, towards the stranger. But I did remember, actually, of course, a core argument, which I think you referred to in your question before that, or even before that, about the replacement of God with history. And I deal with that at the start of that second chapter is, saying the phrase "history will judge." History will judge you, Donald Trump and Brexit voters for what you've done. But also, there's a lot of other similar phrases that get used that we almost all use at some stage, sometimes like, historians will say that, this person has done a really bad thing right there. It's kind of a figure of speech for many of us. It's gone into the sort of the existential bloodstream of our society. That's just a way really of saying something, that you think and giving it kind of an added authority on the top. These future historians or, history in the future will say that I'm right now. But that's, as I say, is very much in the progressive style. And if you just replace that word history, say history will judge, with God will judge, you've got the last judgment. So it's almost a straight sort of picking out of that Christian tradition. Like I say, the same style.
Well, let's think about some of the people or classes of people that would employ progressivism or at least inhabit the progressive world. So let's talk a little bit about the expert class, which we'll hear commentators like Matt Goodwin write about quite frequently, the new elite. And we hear the words technocracy used quite a lot at the moment, which is ultimately a type of a style of governance in which technical experts are to be judged with particular sections of society. They know best, they're experts. Anyway, let's talk about the globalized marketplace that we're in, its implications on those outside of it, and specifically technocrats and those who are part of the expert class. You write that technocrats treat ends as already decided and not up for debate, which has the effect of significantly reducing the space of politics. And then the implication is that they see themselves as neutral, justified, and on the right side of history, and any challenges as being authoritarian. So what are you getting at when you talk about politics effectively being reduced through the expansion of the expert class?
Well, I think I'd like to think you just explained it.
Oh, there you go. Making your job easy for you.
Yeah, no, exactly. In that, again, I go back to talking about a style. You can talk about an expert style or the technocrat style. And the expert, in a progressive sense, is an expert in society and history. Someone who understands the progression from past to present and then into the future, who can make predictions. They're an expert because they know what's going to happen next. Or rather, to get into how it really works, a lot of the time is we know what's going to work if you guys have power. If our opponents have power, it's all going to go pear-shaped, it's all going to go wrong, and we know that, and we will keep on saying it, and we will treat it as a form of knowledge. And then obviously if we are in power, as hopefully we are, if we have the if people call us experts, then we have that authority, which is obviously a form of power. So in a sense, that expert status, it comes with a form of conservative politics. So we want to preserve that status, and therefore we need to keep the bad guys out. So we need to denounce them. We need to say that they're wrong, they're factually wrong, and all that. And that means, just by default, by treating the utterances, the beliefs, whatever, of certain people, let's say, just as an example, conservatives, right-wingers, Brexit voters, Trump supporters, whatever, they are wrong. They are factually wrong. What they want to do will lead us to go into a really bad place. So they really need to be stopped. And we know that, it's a practical form of knowledge. So by doing that, you curtail the possible forms of politics, if you succeed, of course. And luckily, the remnants of our liberal democratic society still holding on, and we can still talk as we are here. But as they approach it, that expert technocrat class, they are really always striving to close off avenues where opponents can talk. For example, appear on TV. There's a constant talk, and you get it not just from activists, but high ups in society of, why is Nigel Farage appearing on Question Time all the time? They need to stop him. And it's remarkable how common that sort of viewpoint is. In our world of social media, we can actually see a lot of the high ups in society completely agreeing with that. So I hope that addressed your question.
It does. It does. I also know we've focused in quite a lot on people who are left liberal so far, and indeed it's the subtitle of your book, which I think your publishers chose. But actually, I think it's important to point out that you did say this is not a tool only employed by people on the left. That actually,
of course.
So where else do we see this taking place outside of those who we would typically label as leftists or progressives?
Well, I think, again, it's very much a style, and since it's a dominant style, then people who are not dominant, who are pretenders to the throne, they think, well, that sounds right, so, I'm going to say the same type of thing. Like, for example, at the moment, the Labour government is in trouble, and reform is flying high in the polls. So you get a lot of people saying, well, inevitably Labour's going to lose the next election. Even, Starmer might have to step down because they're doing so badly at the moment. Inevitably, reform will triumph, and the whole sort of, maybe the whole liberal left technocrat expert class will get their just desserts. That's a completely progressive framing. We inevitably eventually will win. The as in writing the book and also afterwards, I've just I keep on being surprised and shocked by how prevalent this framing is, in every corner of society, and the way we think, the way we address our personal lives. I haven't talked in the book so much about personal lives, but it's a really major aspect to it. It's so much a style that we adopt that, not always that so much history, that we have a theory that history is moving forward, but it's like we are the vehicles of things improving. So whenever we triumph and whenever we succeed, that's an example of the whole of society getting better, And and all sorts of things come with that. For example, thinking about sociology, and how, again, this goes back to sorry, I'm losing my train of thought a little bit, but it's of how history is improving, which is really it's a juncture of history and sociology. So causation, one thing leads to another. That's really sociology, and then over a long time, it kind of that works into history. And as things get better, as we succeed over time, then history over time, gets better, and eventually we win. Society wins. I hope that addresses. I'm sort of conscious that I was rambling a little bit there, maybe losing my way.
No. That it all made sense, and I see it sometimes within myself, and I think listeners to the show will realise that not entirely happy with the form of governance that we live under and have done in the Western world for some time now. It's but that said, I try and catch myself when I see that there seems to be momentum that might push us in a different direction, one that intuitively I tend to prefer. But I try to take that Frodo Baggins approach, which is power is to be treated with care, and by courting it and by effectively hoping that it comes your way and believing that it will be better in your hands, well, there are a whole bunch of pretty quick assumptions being made there, which without being treated with the appropriate care, it can all go badly wrong.
And there are all sorts of consequences to it. It's ideas I've been playing with about politics as well. The way, if you have this assumption that things will be all right in the end, history will work itself out. The bad people will get their just desserts. A happy ending. That's basically an excuse to just not bother, isn't it? To actually not work hard, politically to make things happen. It's like, well, okay, the forces are working in our direction. So basically I'll just sit back and sort of commentate on it from the side. And it's one of the themes in the final chapter of the book where I'm addressing what we should do is actually we really do need to step up. People do. And actually organize. And I mean, you doing this is an example of that. Is a small example, bringing people together to discuss, develop ideas, share them, and then hopefully do something with them. And it takes a whole massive series of such small events over many years, I think, to change things for the better. You can't just rely on history doing it for you.
No, and whilst I wouldn't necessarily say the people who attend it and indeed organise it would be tending in that direction, and they're definitely getting their hands on the wheel, is Jordan Peterson's Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which has grown into a huge annual event. I think their strapline is the arc of history bends towards justice, and so
of course.
in itself it has that inherent progressive worldview. But as I would say, is I think whatever people think of the people who attend those and are pushing various counter alternatives to the current way of things, is they're trying to bend the history toward justice as they see it, rather than allowing it to happen. But it's just interesting that a progressive framing,
very much so. Yeah, definitely more of a liberal progressive framing.
Absolutely.
And I discussed that if you like to simplify it, two different forms of progressivism out there. You have the open liberal form, which if you like was was the dominant form during colonialism, or I tend to think, there's a lot going on in that process, and not least there was distance between people sitting in offices or, wherever in London, pontificating about, the progress of civilization through colonialism, and actually what happened on the ground often are just completely separate issues. But you have that story, and as you say, the Jordan Peterson's group is, if you like, kind of going back to that. And I see that form, that open form, if you like, that liberal form, which is basically confident in the future, and has faith in that sense, is less harmful than the closed, generally left wing sort of version. It can be right wing, but it's generally leftist, which is basically looking to grab hold of things and control them and make sure they go in the right direction. The kind of the liberal side of things is more, like I say, more faithful that things, if we leave them be, they will work themselves out. Although there is a twist, of course, to the likes of Jordan Peterson and a lot of politicians around at the moment thinking of, I think J.D. Vance is a better example than Donald Trump, who I sort of struggle to praise just because of what he's like. Kemi Badenoch, I think, is an example. You could talk about reform to Robert Jenrick again in the Tories. They become more muscular and conscious that actually you need to fight. It's not enough, as I think liberal progressives have done over many decades, of just kind of sitting back and letting it all hang out. And which is basically going along with whoever happens to, attain power at any one period of time. You just think, well, they're bound to be okay, or if they're not, we'll sort of lean on them and just sort of show them the right way, and everything will be fine in the end. I think a lot of people on that liberal side have now realised that isn't enough. Which actually, politics is back, as Boris Glassman says, I think quite rightly. So there's quite interesting aspects going on there at the moment. I think in the political arena, like I say, more muscular liberalism. How it will work itself out, I don't know.
Well, you just brought up J.D. Vance, as people will know, Vice President of the United States, part of the Trump administration, which very much ran on an anti-progressive line. They had effectively created their own counter-elite, decided what they were going to do when they get into power, which was to dismantle various structures that had been built up towards a left-leaning progressive worldview over many decades. But perhaps we can talk a little bit about the nature of the USA from its foundations. I think you made some interesting points in the book. Do you think that the USA's foundations make it inherently progressive because it has an unbounding faith in progress and a faith in economic growth?
Yes, I think so. I mean, that's in, it's very much, it's worked into the American Constitution. The pursuit of happiness. Pursuit means activity, movement, going after something, So that's very much an agenda of change and transformation. You're trying to grab at something. You're not just sitting around and sitting on the porch and having a nice drink and talking to the neighbours. You're actually striving. You're going out, to work. And I think, that is very much in the American DNA, and very very much what we've been talking about. The two types of progress have been fighting each other very hard out there, liberal versus closed, generally left-wing, social justice focused. And it's quite religious in style, obviously. I mean, I think of the civil rights movement, which still very much is a standard style for speakers in American politics to adopt. to speak like preachers.
Mm.
And that goes back to the beginnings of America as well, and the Puritans. And the Puritans were strong believers in progress. So I think that American example, I mean, obviously it's had a huge influence on the rest of the world. It's sort of come back at us as well. So I hope that addresses what you were driving at.
It does. I wanted to start to unpick the impact of liberalism as it was formed in the 17th century on the rest of the world. And obviously the USA is a huge vector for that. And as you say, not just the Anglophone countries end up being impacted by it, but everyone. And to unpack the 17th century liberalism bit a little bit, you quote a few times passages from John Locke, who was very influential on the foundation of America and liberalism more broadly. And one of the passages you quote talk about how effectively the pursuit of land and making it productive is effectively a providential thing, something that we ought to do and must do, and it's the right thing to do. And I wonder, and hopefully this isn't too loose a connection, how much that even impacts our approach today with immigration policy. You say in the book that the government has effectively become a manufacturer of people in the supply chain. Do you think we can see strands of that 17th century liberalism in the obsession with population growth at all costs?
Yes. And it's an argument that I made in the book, and it's quite a difficult one. So I may not completely nail it here. But yeah, I mean, John Locke's conception was basically you have a right to land by working on it. And this was hugely influential in America and in justifying, conquering the West and taking land that was for them freely available. If, those classic homesteaders went out and they worked hard, they worked their land, then they had a right to it. And I think that sort of conception very much remains with us. But it's not, I mean, John Locke was writing about agriculture and he was very interested in how productive land was. And obviously that's not such a preoccupation with us. But what is a preoccupation of us is GDP and maximizing production through, all sorts of activities. And the easiest way to do that, as our technocratic class has found, is actually to bring more and more people in. So you have, for example, look at Britain, relatively small piece of land, increase the population, and you get more and more production, more and more GDP, more money coming into the coffers of the treasury, which can then be spent on, or, maybe reducing taxes or increasing social programs or whatever. And I think that's the basic conception that we have of, or what our technocratic class has, political class has, of what it means to be a country, which I think has a lot of quite interesting and serious consequences, like you say with immigration, because it means, it's meant basically changing the very nature of the country, whether it's a society or a community, whether, or I think the multiculturalist phrase is the community of communities, which may make more sense now. But the sort of the very idea of the national community is very much under threat now, if not arguably gone already. And I think it's largely down to that attitude to land. But like I say, it's a lengthy, or what's a better word for it? It's a bit of a stretch, I think, as an argument. I think it does work. I thought about it a lot and questioned it, but it's a jump from John Locke talking about agriculture in the 17th century to mass immigration now. Yeah,
it is a jump, and however, I think it's only a jump if we're not conscious of the ongoing conversation about the impact of that kind of liberalism. Because when I was reading your book, I felt like I was hearing echoes of some of the arguments of the Romantics in the 19th century. I've been reading plenty of Thomas Carlyle recently, which I mentioned in another recent episode, so I won't rehash it too much. But he railed against the kind of monomaniacal nature of the time in the Industrial Revolution, of focusing on the cash nexus above all, that everything was transactional, but that you couldn't run a country purely based on the cash nexus, because then you'd realize that you stripped it of its soul and everything else that's important in human life. And I would say that if you look at our policies, at least, I'm not necessarily saying everyone thinks this way, but if you look at the policies of our government as you've just outlined them, we're still effectively litigating against that very notion that the likes of Thomas Carlyle was, which is everything just seems to be through economic growth, and so everything's for sale, right? And so I don't think it's a jump if people are new to the conversation, which many people might well be, because I don't know how many people think about the Romantics, but it does strike me that you do find very popular people like Paul Kingsnorth, for example, who's almost like a neo-romantic, making a lot of cut through with a reader base of every age, because he speaks about the other things that make life rich. And in many ways, your book, whilst a more academic analysis of the situation, is kind of doing the same, which is, I mean, you say that capitalists and progressives are in many ways natural allies, because the progressive way of being privileges disruption and change that capitalism constantly delivers in practice. And so I think it's interesting to watch people put their hands up and say it can't just be about that. And it doesn't matter whether it's Paul Kingsnorth, Orthodox Christian, Charlie Downs, a right-wing Zoomer, whether it's you, who kind of has social democratic tendencies, is people find common cause and say, oh, what we're running our whole society on here is too thin for human nature.
Yes, definitely. But I think, there are, going back to the two kinds of progressivism, we've got them all two working in concert at the moment. We've got that economic liberal style, but we've also got the close social justice left-wing form of progressive, which is very, very strong, of course, in our society. And that's providing or purporting, trying to provide, like, the other side, if you like, maybe more moralistic than romantic. In fact, I wouldn't really trace much romanticism in it at all. But it certainly does come, one of the sources of that is very much a sort of a yearning for a better society. It's sort of an unfocused yearning for, I think it just basically sort of degrades into power. And that's very much, my argument in the book is that progressivism too often, virtually always, I think, just by its nature, does degrade into power politics.
Absolutely. I mean, in many ways, I think it seems natural that it does that, because most of the shtick of progressives is railing against power. It's accusing those that are currently, in their minds, part of the establishment, which must be destroyed, of being abusing power, and that the people that they're trying to bring down see everything in power relations, and really we're all being oppressed by them.
And it's very interesting the way as well that they don't consider themselves as agents in a certain way. And this is very much part of progressive ideology, I think, in that they see themselves as part of historical progression. So they're almost like a default. And then anyone who's sort of acting against that, restraining them, pulling society in another direction, is actually an agent and is disturbing the rightful progression of history. and therefore is, that they use words like, God, I tend to forget these things sometimes, but just very much, action words about their opponents, that are, forgive me, I've completely forgotten things that I know. Things that I know and think about every day. Words have just gone.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's a very interesting dynamic, and I really wish I could explain it better. Of considering yourself as being part of history with maybe a big H, which is, there's almost like two different lines. There's actual history, which is going up and down, and then there's sort of theoretical, ideological history, which is where these people are on, which is a path which is going upwards and improving, and real history is being dragged away by the bad people. So they are the actors, and then we, who are the agents of history, if you like, are just sociological defaults in a way.
Before I let you go, because I know we're coming up to a relatively hard stop, might go over a couple of minutes. Is we talk about the progress trap. And we've seen that we all fall into it almost regardless of where we sit on the spectrum. But right now we suffer it more through the left liberal progressive worldview. So before I ask you the question that I ask all of my guests, which I started asking the episode after I first interviewed you, Ben, the question is about the progress trap. What can we do to escape it?
Well, I think by doing things like you're doing, but I guess by writing a book about it. But really, I mean, in that final chapter, when I seek to address it, I zero down at one stage on what I call the intelligence functions of society. So that's the universities, the media, say think tanks, those who are dealing with knowledge, and those are the ones I think which are crucial nodes in society which have gone wrong and been led astray. I mean, the BBC is the classic example for me. I call it a promotional organisation now, that it's doing publicity a lot of the time. It's carrying out PR, it's carrying out public relations for different types of people, and you can see this especially, say, on the website where they're promoting drag queens all the time and other forms of progressive identity politics. They'll give interviews to certain activists. It's like, well, what? Why are you doing this? You're meant to be a news service, an impartial news service, and you're just basically doing free publicity, free PR for these people. So I talk about in the book about reconstitution, how we've got to come up with a proper plan to reconstitute our major institutions. Another one, of course, is the civil service. Just crucial. I mean, what a task. I mean, these are like huge world historical almost tasks, to deal with. But I think that's what's necessary there. These institutions are in such a bad shape, and our society is really suffering for it in many different ways. And I think we're going to have a lot more troubles in the future. And for the good of all of us and our children, we need to drag them back, I think.
Well, Ben, if we're going to be on the right side of history, I think you and I need to go and lead the purge.
All right. Yeah, me and you.
Yeah, there we go. We've fallen into the progress trap, but at least it's the good side. Yeah. Ben, before I let you go, the question I've come to ask all of my guests is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life that you perhaps once thought was an absolute, but then it changed? And what was it that made you think differently?
Well, in the last time I appeared, which wasn't that long ago, I said the Labour Party. And actually,
I did ask you the question. You're right. Yes, it was the Labour Party.
And the fact that I used to have faith that the Labour Party could change, and now I don't. Although some people, do work to drag me back a little bit, like Morris Glassman. But basically, I've decided that's not happening. But I'd say another one I thought for that, I mean, it relates to the book, is just an assumption, just that basic assumption that things will get better, eventually. People will realize that things are going wrong and we need a correction. And then actually people will gather together, the political parties, the establishment, the civil service, and they'll work to make things better. And I've lost that faith now. Basically, I've lost the faith in progress, you could say. But I see that as a positive thing, because it means politics is back. We actually have to work hard to achieve things, and maybe ironically then progress will actually happen. I don't know.
Well, if there's one lesson from this, progress needs to be worked on, can't just be assumed. Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure. We've been talking about your new book, Progress Trap, The Modern Left and the False Authority of History. Am I right in saying that it is released on the 29th of May, 2025?
The 30th of May, it's
30th.
out. And it should be in most bookshops, but certainly online as well. And if you want a discount, you should be able to go to my social media, my Twitter account, or contact me, and I can sort out a discount for you.
There you go. Well, I will include details of that within the show.
Yes,
for those
let's do that. Yeah.
Who tune in. Well, I think people know where to find you. You've mentioned Twitter. You've got a book coming out, and you write a Substack as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's not that regular now, but I'll be updating, through the book publication process, and I don't know what I'm going to do with it beyond that. Okay.
Well, Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thanks very much for giving me the chance to have a chat about it.
Well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. Look forward to the next one.
Good stuff. Thanks very much.
Keep fighting the good fight, Ben.
Cheers, John.
To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.